In October 2017, Restaurant Brands International's share price reached an all-time high of 85 Canadian dollars. In the same month, the company that owned Tim Hortons, the chain that those shares supposedly represented, had already spent 3 consecutive years systematically dismantling the operational infrastructure that built Canada's most iconic brand. One number defines what happened next. In the Leger research poll of Canada's most reputable companies, Tim Hortons ranked 4th in 2017. In 2018, it ranked 50th. Not a gradual decline, not a measured erosion, a single-year drop of 46 positions in the country's most comprehensive annual reputation survey, the largest single-year fall recorded among all 250 companies analysed. There is a second number that belongs beside it, 12.5 billion Canadian dollars. That is what 3G Capital, through its Burger King vehicle, paid for Tim Hortons in December of 2014. For that price, the Brazilian private equity firm acquired the chain that commanded 76% of the Canadian baked goods market, 62% of the Canadian coffee market, and a cultural authority over Canadian identity that no brand research firm had ever fully managed to quantify. For that price, 3G Capital acquired more than a fast food chain. It acquired a national institution. What it did with that institution is the story that the numbers tell. In the years between 2014 and 2020, the numbers are specific. Within 1 year of the acquisition, by some estimates, up to half of Tim Hortons' head office and regional staff had been eliminated. Corporate staff dwindled to what insiders described as less than half of pre-takeover levels, replaced by young MBA graduates with no experience in the Canadian food service industry. The Par Baking lawsuit, filed by franchisees in 2008, alleging that the company tripled the cost to produce a single donut from 6 cents to 18 cents, was dismissed in 2012, but the quality complaints it documented did not go away. They accelerated. A confidential letter dated March 10, 2017, obtained by the Globe and Mail, delivered the verdict in plain terms. The Tim Hortons brand is being destroyed, along with franchisees' economic health. The letter was signed by the Great White North Franchisee Association, a new organization representing half of all Tim Hortons franchise owners in Canada, formed because the relationship between the brand and the people who operated it had deteriorated so completely that collective legal action became the only available response. 3 things happened to Tim Hortons. It rose from a single donut shop in Hamilton, Ontario, into an empire that fed Canada's identity as surely as it fed Canadian families. Then it was sold, twice, to owners who understood its financial value, but not its social architecture. Then the numbers that should have been warning signs were read as success metrics, right up to the moment they became impossible to misread. Welcome inside the Hamilton Donut Shop, the Oakville boardrooms, and the franchise locations where Canada's most beloved fast food chain was built across 5 decades, and where, in the years after 2014, the price of that 5-decade achievement was calculated and collected. May 17, 1964, Hamilton, Ontario. The number is 2. 2 products, coffee and donuts. That is the complete menu of the first Tim Horton donut store when it opens on May 17, 1964, at a location in Hamilton, Ontario. No sandwiches, no muffins, no Timbits. Those will not exist for another decade. 2 products, a counter, and a name that belongs to a man who is, at the time of opening, more famous for his body checks than for his baking. Miles Gilbert Tim Horton is born in Cochrane, Ontario, on January 12, 1930. He plays defense in the National Hockey League for 24 years, spending the bulk of his career with the Toronto Maple Leafs, winning 4 Stanley Cup championships in 1962, 63, 64, and 67. He is not a businessman by training. He is an athlete who understands in the early 1960s that athletes age out of their primary income and that a secondary enterprise is not optional for a man with a family to support. The first partner in the donut venture is Jim Charade, who departs in 1966. He is replaced by a different kind of partner, Ron Joyce, a former Hamilton police constable who takes over the fledgling Tim Horton donut shop at 65 Ottawa Street North in 1965. By 1967, after the opening of 2 additional stores, Horton and Joyce formalize their arrangement as equal partners. The arithmetic of the partnership is straightforward for 7 years, 2 men, 40 stores by 1974. A Canadian donut market that has virtually no organized competition at scale. Then the partnership ends, in a way that no balance sheet anticipated. At approximately 3 in the morning on February 21, 1974, Tim Horton loses control of his De Tomaso Pantera sports car on the Queen Elizabeth Way in St. Catharines, Ontario. He has played a game in Toronto the previous evening. He is driving alone back to Buffalo. His autopsy, released 30 years after his death, documents the presence of drugs and alcohol. He is 44 years old. The chain he founded has 40 stores. Ron Joyce buys out the Horton family's shares for $1 million Canadian and a Cadillac Eldorado. Horton's widow, Laurie, later challenges the sale in court, loses in 1993, and loses the appeal in 1995. She dies in 2000 at age 68. The $1 million number that Joyce pays for 40 Tim Hortons stores in 1974 is the number against which everything that follows must be measured. What those 40 stores will become, and what they will be sold for, and sold again, is a study in the distance between the price of a thing and its value. Then something nobody wanted to name out loud begins. The thing Ron Joyce builds will eventually be worth more than any number anyone involved in the founding ever imagined. And that worth will attract exactly the kind of ownership that Tim Horton, the man, would never have chosen. 1974 through 1995. From 40 stores to a national institution. The numbers that Ron Joyce produces in the years following Tim Horton's death are the numbers of a man who understands one thing with uncommon clarity. In a country as large and as cold as Canada, a reliable cup of affordable coffee in a warm room is not a luxury. It is a necessity. 40 stores in 1974, 100 in 1976, 200 by the early 1980s, 500 in 1991. The expansion is not random. Joyce understands that Canada's geography, the vast distances between communities, the concentration of population along highway corridors, the culture of the Tim Hortons coffee run as a social ritual rather than a transaction, creates a specific opportunity for a brand that occupies every available location before any competitor can. In 2000, Tim Hortons surpasses McDonald's as Canada's largest food service operator. This is a statistic worth reading twice. McDonald's, the largest fast food chain in the history of the world, operating in 120 countries, backed by $40 billion in annual revenue, is smaller in Canada than a donut chain that started with 2 products in a Hamilton strip mall. Tim Hortons accounts for 22.6% of all fast food industry revenues in Canada by 2005. Coffee market share, 62% of the Canadian market. Baked goods, 76% by number of customers served. These are not ordinary numbers. These are the numbers of a monopoly that is not legally a monopoly because consumers choose it freely. Because going to Tim Hortons is not just a purchase, it is a ritual. The morning lineup, the double-double, the Roll Up the Rim contest, launched in 1986, which distributes more than 31 million prizes annually by 2007. The Timbits hockey program, sponsoring children's minor hockey. The Tim Horton Children's Foundation, founded by Joyce after Horton's death, eventually sending thousands of underprivileged children to summer camps across North America, funded by Camp Day coffee sales. The Canadian author Pierre Berton captures what no financial metric can. In so many ways, the story of Tim Hortons is the essential Canadian story. It is a story of success and tragedy, of big dreams and small towns, of old-fashioned values and tough-fisted business, of hard work and of hockey. Joyce sells Tim Hortons to Wendy's International in August of 1995 for approximately $600 million Canadian dollars. The Toronto Star eulogizes the sale as the spectacle of another great Canadian icon gone to Yankee burger fat. Joyce, who has built 40 stores into a $600 million empire in 21 years, becomes the largest shareholder in the merged entity. He then spends the rest of his life donating $185 million of his personal wealth to Canadian youth and education. He dies on January 31st, 2019, at 88 years old. But not before he writes a letter in 2017 to Tim Hortons franchisees in revolt against a new owner, telling them that what he has witnessed at Tim Hortons is troubling, to say the least. August 8, 1995 through 2006, the Wendy's years. The sale of Tim Hortons to Wendy's International in 1995 produces a specific number that the Canadian press repeats like a verdict: $600 million. That is the price Wendy's pays for a chain that Ron Joyce bought for $1 million 21 years earlier. The arithmetic of what Joyce built is 600 times the purchase price. The arithmetic of what Wendy's bought is the question that the subsequent decade will answer. Under Wendy's ownership, Tim Hortons continues to expand. Wendy's brings capital, operational systems, and the international distribution infrastructure that Joyce never possessed. The 500th store had opened in 1991. By the time the chain regains independence through its initial public offering in March of 2006, selling shares at $27 each, raising more than $700 million in the first day of trading, the number of Canadian locations stands at approximately 3,500. United States locations, 817. The IPO is a commercial triumph. On September 24, 2006, Wendy's spins off its remaining 82% stake to shareholders. Tim Hortons is added to Canada's benchmark stock market indicator, the S&P TSX Composite Index, and the S&P TSX 60 on the same day. But here's what the ledgers were already showing during this period of apparent strength. Tim Hortons is not immune to the first cracks in its quality narrative. In 2003, the Halifax Daily News reports that Tim Hortons outlets in Atlantic Canada will no longer serve fresh donuts. The product, once baked on site each night for the morning rush, will now be par-baked, partly cooked at a central Brantford, Ontario facility, frozen, shipped, and finished in each restaurant throughout the day. The par-baking decision is, in financial terms, efficient. In narrative terms, it is the first breach of the always fresh promise that is, at that moment, Tim Hortons' primary marketing slogan. In 2008, two franchisees file a class action lawsuit alleging that the par-baking system tripled their cost to produce a single donut from 6 cents to 18 cents, required the purchase of new equipment they were not warned about, and reduced franchisee profitability while increasing corporate margins. The case is dismissed in February of 2012. The donut, however, has changed. The number that closes this era is 12.5 billion Canadian dollars. That is what Burger King, controlled by 3G Capital, pays for Tim Hortons in December of 2014. The chain that Joyce sold to Wendy's for $600 million in 1995 sells to 3G Capital for $12.5 billion 19 years later. The multiplication factor between those two prices is the measure of what Canada's loyalty to the brand has been worth in market terms. What comes next will test whether that loyalty is transferable to new owners who intend to extract it rather than sustain it. December 15, 2014, Oakville, Ontario. The number that 3G Capital's representatives use most often in the weeks before and after the completion of the Restaurant Brands International merger is 34. That is the age of Daniel Schwartz, the Burger King CEO who becomes the CEO of the combined entity. In the weeks before the deal closes, Schwartz conducts 15-minute interviews with dozens of Tim Hortons vice presidents, directors, and senior managers, one by one, in a room with Alexandra Baring, one of 3G's founding partners, to determine which of them will retain their positions in the new organization. Some meetings last as little as 5 minutes. The Globe and Mail's investigation, published in 2017, reconstructs what happens next with the precision of a forensic report. The job cuts begin before the deal closes. They continue for more than a year, with progressively less generous severance. The operation is conducted from a command center manned by Heitor Gonçalves, RBI's Chief People and Information Officer and a 3G stalwart. A trailer for RBI's Accenture advisors is parked outside the Oakville headquarters. The purge, according to a former manager quoted in the Globe investigation, was planned down to the minute. The estimate that circulates among former employees and industry analysts, up to 50% of Tim Hortons' head office and regional staff are eliminated through layoffs and voluntary departures within the first year. RBI disputes the exact percentage. The former managers who describe the process do not. What replaces the institutional knowledge of 50 years of Canadian food service experience is a management philosophy imported directly from 3G's work at Burger King, Heinz, and Anheuser-Busch. Zero-based budgeting, in which every expense must be justified from scratch each year rather than carried forward from prior budgets. Centralized procurement that requires franchisees to purchase from approved suppliers at prices set by the corporation, and an efficiency-driven metric system that measures operational performance, but not the harder-to-quantify variables of community connection and consumer trust. Then something nobody wanted to name out loud begins to register in the numbers. The share price reaches all-time highs in October 2017. The revenue figures reported by RBI are strong. The cost reductions generate impressive corporate margins. The Tim Hortons same-store sales that would reveal the damage being done to the brand's consumer relationship are declining, but declining slowly enough in the early years that the headline numbers remain defensible. The confidential letter from the Great White North Franchisee Association, dated March 10, 2017, is not defensible. It says, in writing, that the Tim Hortons brand is being destroyed. It says that franchisees' economic health is being destroyed alongside it. It names the specific mechanisms: product shortages caused by supply chain disruptions from the cost-cutting program, quality and safety concerns at locations that lack sufficient staffing because labor cost reduction has been mandated from above, franchisee costs rising while franchisee revenues fall. The letter is addressed to RBI CEO Daniel Schwartz. Co-founder Joyce writes his own letter in the same period, stating that what he has witnessed is troubling, to say the least. Don Schroeder, a former Tim Hortons CEO, writes a companion letter. 3 men who collectively built and led the chain for 50 years are, simultaneously, writing letters to its current owner, warning that it is being destroyed. 2017 through 2019, The Legal Reckoning. The arithmetic of the Great White North Franchisee Association's grievances is specific and verifiable. Franchisees are required to pay royalty fees to Tim Hortons' parent company. They are required to purchase food, supplies, and equipment from a list of RBI-approved suppliers at prices set by RBI. They contribute to a $700 million national advertising fund managed by the parent company. And after the 3G-driven restructuring of 2014 through 2017, each of these financial obligations has increased, while the revenue that is supposed to sustain them has declined. The first lawsuit the GWNFA files in 2017 alleges that RBI improperly used funds from the $700 million advertising fund, taking money intended for consumer-facing marketing and redirecting it to pay corporate overhead expenses. The second lawsuit, filed in the same year, alleges that RBI is attempting to block franchisees' right to organize as an association, an allegation that the word intimidation appears in subsequent court filings to describe. Nearly half of Tim Hortons' American franchisees join a parallel association by mid-2017. An amended complaint filed in Florida federal court uses the phrase pattern of conduct to describe RBI's approach to silencing franchisee opposition. The GWNFA also alleges that RBI requires franchisees to renovate locations at a cost of $450,000 per restaurant, and that the threat of required renovation is used to devalue stores and force smaller operators out in favor of preferred multi-unit owners. This is not a claim about operational standards. It is a claim about power, that the renovation requirement is a financial weapon deployed against franchisees who resist RBI's direction. RBI Chairman Daniel Schwartz responds in a shareholder communication that negative media created by this group of franchisees is having a negative impact on customer perceptions of the Tim Hortons brand. The statement is technically correct. It is also a document of the precise moment at which a corporate parent has confused the symptom with the disease. Both lawsuits are eventually settled. The terms are not publicly disclosed in full. What is publicly disclosed is the consumer research conducted during this period. An Angus Reid Institute survey published in April of 2018 finds that Canadians are 4 times more likely to say their opinion of Tim Hortons has worsened than improved over the prior 3 years. Among the specific dimensions measured, 25% of customers say service quality has worsened, 3 times the number who say it has improved. The net service rating, improved minus worsened, is negative 17 points. The equivalent rating for Starbucks, Tim Hortons' primary premium competitor, is positive 5. The numbers are a ledger of accumulated disappointment. Each bad service experience, each baked good that does not taste the way it did in 2012. Each franchise location where labor costs have been cut to the point that the lineup is long and the staff is thin. Individually, each data point is anecdotal. Collectively, they represent a 46-position drop in Canada's annual reputation ranking. January 2018, Hamilton, Ontario, and beyond. The Ontario government raises the provincial minimum wage from $11.60 per hour to $14 per hour, effective January 1, 2018. The increase is 22%. For a Tim Hortons franchise employing an average of 35 staff members, the wage hike costs the franchise owner approximately $7,000 Canadian dollars per employee per year in additional labor costs, before any additional payroll taxes and benefits are calculated. McDonald's, Cara Foods, and Starbucks respond to the minimum wage increase by permitting their franchise operators to raise menu prices to offset the added labor cost. RBI, the parent company of Tim Hortons, makes a different decision. It does not reduce the supply cost charged to Tim Hortons franchisees to offset the wage increase, and it does not authorize franchisee-level menu price increases to recover it. What some Tim Hortons franchisees do instead is documented in leaked memos that reach the national press within days. Paid breaks are cut. Contributions to employee health plans are reduced. In at least one instance, a memo posted in a franchise location instructs employees to contact Premier Kathleen Wynne and inform her that they will not vote Liberal in the coming Ontario election in June 2018. Ontario Premier Wynne responds publicly. Taking it out on employees is not fair and not acceptable. The memos are written by individual franchise owners. The decisions are made by individual franchise operators. Legally, the responsibility does not rest with RBI. Perceptually, in the national media coverage that follows, the name attached to the controversy is Tim Hortons. Approximately 50 demonstrations are held across Canada, including 38 in Ontario alone. A consumer boycott campaign called No Timmy's Tuesday spreads through social media. The Reputation Institute's 2018 survey records what happens to brand reputation when the legal distinction between franchisor and franchisee collapses in the public imagination. Tim Hortons falls from 4th to 50th among 250 companies measured, the most significant single-year reputation decline of any company in the survey's history. RBI's stock price, which has been climbing since the merger, also begins to retreat. From the $85 peak in October of 2017, it falls towards $70 by early 2018. The efficiency model that has generated record corporate margins is, in the language of the share price, beginning to price in the cost of what it has done to the brand. The number that the franchise community is watching most carefully during this period is not the share price. It is the same-store sales figure. In the first quarter of 2017, Tim Hortons same-store sales in Canada declined 0.2%. In the same period 1 year later, the decline has accelerated. By year-end 2019, total system-wide sales have fallen to $6.7 billion, a decline of 2.9% in the final quarter alone, which RBI CEO Jose Sill publicly describes as disappointing. 2003 through 2019, the quality record. The evidence of Tim Hortons' quality decline is not contained in a single dramatic event. It is accumulated across 16 years of documented consumer complaint, franchise legal action, and corporate decision-making that prioritizes margin over product integrity. It begins with par baking in 2003. Before this decision, donuts are made fresh in each Tim Hortons location, nightly, ready for the morning rush. After this decision, donuts are par baked at a central Brantford, Ontario facility, owned by IAWS Group plc, frozen, shipped, and finished in each restaurant. The cost to the consumer in taste terms is subtle and cumulative. The cost to the franchise operator is not subtle. The par baking system triples the fixed cost per donut from 6 cents to 18 cents, requires new equipment purchases, and generates the 2008 class action lawsuit that documents what the switch means economically. The lawsuit is dismissed. The decision stands. In 2009, the New York Times runs a comparison of Tim Hortons' flash frozen product approach against the fresh-baked models of Krispy Kreme and some Dunkin' Donuts locations. The article notes an apparent scarcity of donut specialties such as the Dutchie at newly opened Tim Hortons stores in New York City. By 2014, the Dutchie Timbit is discontinued entirely, cut from the menu due to what the company describes as low popularity, though consumer advocates suggest the par baking process made it less distinctive than it once was. After the 3G acquisition, the product quality concerns compound. The Great White North Franchisee Association's 2017 letter specifically cites product shortages and safety concerns at franchise locations as consequences of the cost-cutting program. The Canadian federal government announces in 2018 that it will investigate franchisee claims that cost-cutting measures have led to diminished quality, service, and safety at Tim Hortons restaurants. The Angus Reid data from 2018 makes the consumer perception specific. 19% of Tim Hortons' own customers say the quality of their double-double has worsened in recent years. 14% say it has improved. For a brand whose entire identity is built on coffee quality and reliability, for a brand whose slogan is always fresh, a net negative quality perception among its own customers is not a data point. It is a structural problem. But here's what the ledgers were already showing through this entire period. The consumers registering quality decline continue to visit Tim Hortons. The lineup at the drive-thru is still long. The daily coffee run is still a cultural habit that does not disappear because of a single disappointing cup. The brand is losing ground on the margin, losing the trust of consumers who will eventually find a reason to change their habit, while appearing in total transaction counts to be holding its position. The distinction between holding transaction volume and building brand equity is the distinction between a short-term and a long-term reading of the same numbers. 3G Capital is, by its own public statements and investment philosophy, a short-term reader of financial metrics. 2017 through 2020, the measurement. The number 46. That is the number of positions Tim Hortons drops in the Leger National Reputation Survey between 2017 and 2018, from 4th to 50th among 250 companies. The survey measures perceived financial stability, corporate social responsibility, honesty, transparency, quality, and innovation. It is, in aggregate, a measurement of public trust. The survey dimensions where Tim Hortons scores worst in 2018 are the most revealing. Not financial stability, the company is, at the corporate level, still profitable. The worst scores come from the dimensions that are hardest to engineer: honesty and transparency. The public's assessment is not that Tim Hortons is failing financially, it is that Tim Hortons is no longer honest about what it is. The analyst commentary from this period is consistent in its diagnosis. A Troy Media assessment published in 2018 notes that Tim Hortons is no longer seen as a Canadian company by the public. Most RBI executives, the piece observes, aren't Canadian, and most employees at head office have never owned, managed, or even worked at a restaurant, let alone at a food service facility in Canada. The traditional uniforms, the roll-up-the-rim campaign, the welcoming counterculture, all of these surface elements persist after the 3G acquisition. What has changed is invisible to the customer standing in line, but visible to the franchise owner paying inflated supply costs and the veteran employee counting a smaller paycheck. The same-store sales numbers make the structural damage concrete. In the fourth quarter of 2019, Tim Hortons' Canadian same-store sales fall 4.6% year-over-year. Total system-wide sales for the full year 2019, $6.7 billion, down 2.9%. Jose Sil, RBI CEO, states publicly in February of 2020, there is clearly a sizable gap between what this brand is capable of and the performance we've delivered. The admission is candid. It is also, in financial terms, exactly 5 years late. In 2020, RBI announces a turnaround plan. $100 million invested in drive-through menu boards, an overhauled loyalty program, which, in its first phase, attracts 7.5 million active loyalty members and a registration rate of 25%. A new focus on coffee quality, including plans to install new espresso machines across the network. A refocus on the uniquely Canadian brand identity that the cost-cutting years had systematically eroded. Then something nobody wanted to name out loud becomes the official statement of the company's own leadership. The brand that 3G Capital acquired for $12.5 billion has been allowed to deteriorate to a level that requires a publicly announced emergency rescue plan, funded by the company itself, executed against a backdrop of still declining same-store sales, and a franchise community that spent 3 years in active legal revolt against the parent company. June 1, 2022. Ottawa. While the operational and quality story of Tim Hortons' decline unfolds in franchise boardrooms and regulatory investigations, a separate chapter opens in a different arena. On June 1, 2022, Canada's Federal Privacy Commissioner, together with provincial privacy officials in Quebec, British Columbia, and Alberta, announces the results of a joint investigation into the Tim Hortons mobile application. The findings are specific. Tim Hortons violated privacy laws by tracking the location data of app users hundreds of times per day, including when the app was not in use. The data collected was used to build consumer profiles, log home and work locations, and track movement patterns in granular detail across an extended period. Tim Hortons' restitution offer to eligible app users: a free coffee and a baked good. The disparity between what was taken and what was offered is the number that defines this chapter. A company that built its reputation on community trust and the simple warmth of an affordable morning coffee offered a free coffee to the customers whose daily movements it had catalogued without their knowledge. The Federal Privacy Commissioner's report does not calculate a financial value for the data collected. It does not need to. The arithmetic of the restitution makes the company's own assessment of the intrusion legible. The app privacy violation is not the story that defines Tim Hortons' decline, The franchise revolt, the quality deterioration, and the 46-position reputation collapse are a more complete account of that decline. But it is a data point that reveals something important about the institutional culture that replaced the culture Ron Joyce built. Ron Joyce built Tim Hortons by understanding that the franchise operator and the customer were the same thing. Human beings whose trust had to be earned every day through the product and the experience and the community involvement that made Tim Hortons not just a place to buy coffee, but a place that felt like it belonged to the people who used it. The institution that violated those customers' location data without their knowledge is a different institution. It has the same name, it has the same logo, it serves coffee from the same Brantford roasting facility. But the architecture of values that once made the name mean something has been replaced by an architecture of extraction. Extracting margin from franchise operators, extracting efficiency from head office staff, extracting data from app users, and the brand reputation numbers document with precision the cost of that extraction. 2020 through 2025. The recovery. The numbers that emerge from Tim Hortons' recovery period are real, and they deserve to be stated as clearly as the numbers of the decline. In 2020, the company launches its loyalty program, eventually branded as Tim's Rewards. By the fourth quarter of 2025, the program has 7 million active members. Those 7 million members spend 50% more per visit than they did before joining the program and visit stores more frequently. Digital ordering and payment reach all-time highs in the fourth quarter of 2025. The same-store sales data tells the recovery story in its most essential form. Canadian same-store sales grow 2.8% year-over-year in the fourth quarter of 2025, outperforming the Canadian quick-service restaurant industry by nearly 2 percentage points. This is the 19th consecutive quarter of positive same-store sales growth for Tim Hortons Canada, 19 straight quarters. Beginning approximately in the first quarter of 2021, the period that follows the public acknowledgement of failure and the launch of the turnaround plan, the same-store sales trend reverses and does not reverse back. Cold beverage sales rise 8.6% year-over-year in the fourth quarter of 2025, representing 27% of total beverage sales, the highest fourth-quarter mix on record. Morning sales grow more than 10% year-over-year in the second quarter of 2025, driven in part by a marketing platform featuring Ryan Reynolds and emphasizing specifically that Tim Hortons uses 100% Canadian farm-certified eggs. The Ryan Reynolds partnership is notable not for the celebrity, but for the message. Canadian eggs, Canadian certification. The brand that spent years being perceived as a Brazilian private equity efficiency model is now investing in a marketing strategy whose core claim is Canadian agricultural provenance. RBI CEO Josh Kobza describes 2025 as a year of strength and durability for Tim Hortons. The language is accurate. It is also significantly more modest than the language that would have been used to describe the brand in 2010, when it commanded 62% of Canada's coffee market and was described, by no less than Pierre Berton, as the essential Canadian story. The distance between the Tim Hortons that existed in 2010 and the Tim Hortons that is recovering in 2025 is not measurable in store counts or same-store sales percentages. It is measurable in the reputation survey data, in the franchise revolt history, in the privacy violation settlement, in the par-baking lawsuit, and in the specific fact that the brand's own parent company had to announce a publicly funded emergency turnaround plan in 2020 because the preceding 5 years of ownership had produced results that even the corporate leadership could not frame as success. 2014 through 2025, the expansion that didn't. When Burger King and Tim Hortons merged in 2014 under the Restaurant Brands International umbrella, one of the primary strategic rationales offered to shareholders was international expansion. Tim Hortons' iconic Canadian status, applied through Burger King's global distribution infrastructure and 3G Capital's operational efficiency model, would produce a global quick-service coffee and donut chain of meaningful scale. The numbers of the international expansion tell a different story. United States locations at the time of the RBI merger, approximately 800. United States locations as of the end of 2025, 683. Not growth, contraction. The American market, which Tim Hortons entered in 1981 in Florida, unsuccessfully, and returned to in 1984 in New York, has resisted every major attempt at scale expansion. In November of 2010, Tim Hortons closed 36 stores in the northeastern United States due to high competition from Dunkin' Donuts and Au Bon Pain, specifically in markets around Providence, Rhode Island and Hartford, Connecticut. The announced 2017 expansion into Ohio's greater Cleveland area, 105 stores planned, produces limited actual results. Locations in Youngstown, Ohio open in 2019 and close within weeks of each other by the end of that year. The story in China is the most ambitious and the most incomplete. In July of 2018, Tim Hortons announces a plan to open 1,500 stores in China. The first opens in Shanghai in February of 2019. As of December 31st, 2024, 6 years into the Chinese expansion, the number of stores operating nationwide is 1,022 in 82 cities. Progress, but not the scale or pace originally projected. The United Kingdom expansion, announced in 2016 and beginning with a Glasgow store in June of 2017, reaches 47 locations in the United Kingdom by February of 2022 and continues to grow. The Philippines, through a franchise partnership, reaches 52 locations by December of 2023. Pakistan, India, South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, each of these markets receives Tim Hortons locations in the 2020 through 2025 period. But here's what the ledgers were already showing during this entire international expansion story. Tim Hortons' core business is, and has always been, Canadian. Canadian same-store sales constitute the overwhelming majority of the brand's financial relevance. The $600 million sale to Wendy's in 1995 was a Canadian success story. The $12.5 billion sale to RBI in 2014 was a Canadian success story. What RBI has built internationally since 2014 does not yet constitute a comparable story, in any market, in any currency. 2023 through 2025. The current account. As of September 2023, Tim Hortons operates 5,701 restaurants. As of August 2024, the number is 5,702, a net addition of one restaurant in 11 months. This is the growth rate of a brand that is managing its existing position, rather than aggressively building a new one. The brand's stated long-term aspiration, growth towards 6,000 Canadian locations, continued international expansion, the US recovery plan that produces the brand's best US growth year in more than a decade, in 2025, exists alongside a historical record that is more cautionary than inspirational. The specific number that contains the largest warning is the reputation figure from 2018, 50th, 4th to 50th in 1 year. A brand can recover from a revenue decline. A brand can recover from a legal dispute with its franchise network. A brand can recover from a privacy violation. The question that the reputation research raises is whether a brand can recover from the public's conclusion that it is no longer honest, that the always fresh promise has been replaced by something less easy to label, something that is technically present but experientially diminished. The 19 consecutive quarters of positive Canadian same-store sales growth suggest that the recovery is real. 7 million active loyalty members who spend 50% more per visit suggest that the digital engagement strategy is working. Cold beverage growth at record highs suggests that the menu evolution is finding the consumer. But the Tim Hortons that Canadians are visiting in 2025 is a different institution than the one that Pierre Berton described, that Pierre Berton could not have described without invoking hockey and small towns and the values of a country that believed its donut chain was actually about something beyond donuts. The sentiment that the Tim Hortons of the 1990s generated was not manufactured by a turnaround plan or a loyalty program. It was the accumulated product of 50 years of a franchise network that was, in the essential sense, Canadian, owned by Canadian families, managed by people who had worked in Canadian food service, connected to the Canadian communities where the franchise locations operated. That accumulated product cannot be recovered through a 7 million member app or a partnership with Ryan Reynolds. It can be approximated, and the numbers of 2025 suggest it is being approximated more successfully than the numbers of 2018 suggested it could be. But the number that remains on the ledger, the number that does not appear in any quarterly earnings release, is the distance between what the brand was and what it now is. That distance is measured not in store counts or same-store sales percentages, but in the specific quality of the cultural claim that Tim Hortons once made and no longer makes with the same authority. 2017. The most important letter in Tim Hortons history. In March of 2017, Joyce writes a letter. He writes it to Tim Hortons franchisees in support of the Great White North Franchisee Association's effort to negotiate with RBI. The letter is not a legal document. It is not a shareholder communication. It is a letter from the man who built 40 stores into a $600 million empire to the men and women who are currently operating what he built, telling them that what he has witnessed is troubling, to say the least. Joyce is 86 years old when he writes this letter. He has been out of Tim Hortons for 22 years, having sold to Wendy's in 1995. He has spent those 22 years donating $185 million to Canadian children and universities, flying across the country to personally interview children for his foundation's camp programs, receiving appointments to the Order of Canada and 7 honorary degrees. He has earned, in the most literal sense, the right to say nothing about the chain that bears Tim Hortons' name and to let the people who purchased it manage it as they see fit. Instead, he writes the letter. The letter is not public in its full text. What is public is its existence, its content as reported by the Globe and Mail, and the fact that it is written at all. The existence of the letter is the number that the balance sheet cannot contain. It is the measurement of a gap between what a company's owner believes and what its financial statements show. It is the record of a founder watching something that took a lifetime to build, being managed in a way that the financial metrics celebrate and the human metrics condemn. Don Schroeder, a former Tim Hortons CEO, writes a companion letter. He says that the callousness with which RBI has treated hundreds of loyal and long-serving members of the Tim Hortons corporate team, as well as countless suppliers who for years had been committed to providing the system with new and innovative products, leaves me with the inescapable conclusion that, in the absence of some collective action, our family of store owners will suffer the same fate. Ron Joyce dies on January 31, 2019. His obituary in the Globe and Mail records that he donated $185 million of his personal wealth to Canadian causes. It records the Order of Canada. It records the 7 honorary degrees. And it records, briefly and without extensive elaboration, the letter he wrote in 2017. The letter in which the man who turned $1 million into $600 million told the current owners of the chain that what they were doing was destroying it. Joyce told the Globe, in his final interview before his death, that the Tim Hortons days are not what he wants to be remembered for. He wants to be remembered for the children he sent to camp. That preference, the man who built Canada's most famous brand preferring to be remembered for something else, is, perhaps, the most revealing number in this entire account. Return to the number. May 17, 1964. 1 donut shop, 2 products, $1 cup of coffee. In today's value, adjusted for inflation, the $600 million sale of Tim Hortons to Wendy's in 1995 represents approximately 1 billion Canadian dollars. The $12.5 billion sale to RBI in 2014 represents $12.5 billion. The difference between those two numbers is the market's valuation of what Canadian consumer loyalty is worth when it has been accumulating, untouched by extraction logic, for 30 years. 3 equations explain what happened. The first equation, the cost of a donut before par baking, is 6 cents. The cost of the same donut after par baking is 18 cents. The difference, 12 cents per donut, is the unit cost of a brand promise being converted into a cost center. Multiplied across hundreds of millions of donuts per year, that 12-cent difference generates substantial corporate savings. Divided by the number of consumers who notice that the donut tastes different, it generates a reputational liability that cannot be calculated in the same quarterly report where the savings appear. The second equation. Tim Hortons ranks 4th in Canada's Reputation Survey in 2017. It ranks 50th in 2018. The cost of that 46th position decline is not a line item in any RBI financial statement. The number of Canadian consumers who changed their relationship with the brand during that 12-month period, who went from habitual Tim Hortons customers to Tim Hortons customers with reservations, is not reported in any earnings call. But the same-store sales figures that follow in 2019, declining 4.6% in Canada in the final quarter, are the financial expression of a consumer trust deficit that accumulated over 5 years and reported itself in a single quarter's revenue line. The third equation. Ron Joyce paid $1 million for 40 stores in 1974. He built those stores into a $600 million enterprise by 2014, measured from the point of the original Wendy's sale, without ever losing the community connection that made Tim Hortons more than a business. 3G Capital paid $12.5 billion for those stores in 2014 and, within 3 years, had produced the largest single-year reputation collapse in Canadian corporate survey history. The mathematics of the two ownership periods are not comparable. The intangibles they each generated are also not comparable, in opposite directions. The final number is 19. 19 consecutive quarters of positive Canadian same-store sales growth by the end of 2025. The recovery is real. The brand is still Canada's largest quick-service restaurant chain, with more than 5,700 locations and billions in annual system-wide sales. The turnaround plan produced results that the turnaround plan's architects can fairly claim credit for. But the brand that recovered in 2025 is recovering toward something, toward a position it can sustain with 7 million loyalty members and record cold beverage sales and a Ryan Reynolds partnership and new espresso machines in its restaurants. What it is not recovering toward is the position it occupied in 2014, when the world's largest private equity firm looked at Canada's most trusted brand and concluded it was undervalued. Joyce built something that was worth $12.5 billion on the open market. The number that no one has publicly stated, in any earnings call or annual report or shareholder letter, is what it would be worth today if the man who wrote the troubling letter had never had reason to write it.